Good afternoon. I am Clare Braham and I'm going to be presenting this webinar today. So the webinar today is the NHS Net Zero Ambitions and how does it impact you. So hopefully all of our people on board has either a supplier into the NHS in relation to different industries and backgrounds. So we will hopefully gain some information for use today. Just a little bit about NQA. NQA has been since 1988, so we're 35 years within the industry. We've got 50,000 certificates globally, and we have got over 1,000 employees worldwide and operating obviously in 90 different countries as well. Again, we are international based certification body and we are America's #1 in aerospace sector. We're also globally #1 certification body in the telecommunications and automotive sector. Within the UK, we are the top 3 certification body for 9,000, 14,000, 45,001 and 27,001, and globally again we are #3 certification body for the aerospace sector as well. So we do, and we're quite a big influence as well within the UK on the greenhouse gas verification and also the PAS 2060, which is the carbon neutrality verification as well. But we will chat about that just at the very end. So what does NQA do? We also do a number of courses. So we do the normal, we do our quality, environmental, energy, health and safety, but probably more importantly in relation to this, we also do medical device standard, which is 13485, and also we do the PAS 2060. It's a 2-day training course for anybody looking to do the PAS 2060. And we also do a 1-day greenhouse gas inventory training course. And we also do a 4-day ISO 14064, and that's a lead verifier course, and that is in relation to greenhouse gases. So some excellent course that is available, and maybe some people within the chat, if you need any details, they're all detailed within the NQA website as well. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Clare Braham. Although this is a little bit maybe out of date, I'm nearly 10 years now working as an auditor within a range of different industries. I do 91445, I also do 13485 as well. So we do a lot of medical device industry clients. As you can tell by my accent, I'm based over here in Northern Ireland. So please, anybody even within the chat, if I start to talk a little bit too fast, because we do talk fast over here, just tell me please to slow down. Hopefully everybody can understand, and I will try and speak a little bit slower. Just a little bit about my background. Obviously I've said a lot of my standards that I have done. However, I also do, I'm a lead greenhouse gas verifier for NQA. And I also am a trainer as well. So I take the training elements for in relation to greenhouse gas inventories and also for the PAS 2060, which is the carbon neutrality standard. So from my background and all of my what I have worked at and my knowledge, I have a very good knowledge both in the medical device industry but also in the greenhouse gas and how the two very much play together and work together hand in hand. So this webinar, it's a 45-minute webinar. There is questions and the questions can be popped into the chat box. Hopefully you'll be able to see a chat box. So enter them in there and we will do a question and answers at the very end. And the webinar will be circulated shortly after we are finished. Hopefully, not too sure if it'll be this evening, but it certainly will be sometime early next week. If there is any questions that we don't get to, please feel free to either email directly into NQA, and we shall come back to you as well thereafter with any answers. There may be questions that I'm not completely au fait with, and I just need to double check and ask colleagues, hence why I've got some colleagues that I do work with here, and we do obviously work very well, and any questions we do communicate together and be able to get back with any answers that need be. So the learning objectives from this webinar is: what is the NHS's net zero ambitions? Building a net zero into the NHS procurement, what net zero in healthcare looks like, and how can you as a supplier meet those expectations? And that is through standards, the ISO 14064-1 and the PAS 2060 standard. And then there will be an element for questions at the very end. So just to begin with, what is the NHS's net zero ambitions? So in October 2020, the NHS became the world's first health service to commit to reaching carbon net zero, and that was in response to a profound and growing threat to health posed by climate change. So there was statutory guidance which has already been issued, and that was to deliver a net zero health service report, and the report set out a clear ambition with 2 evidence-based targets. So then on the 1st of July 2022, the NHS became the first health system to embed net zero into legislation, and that is through the Health and Care Act 2022. So there's legislation within there that governs as well what the NHS is going to do in relation to net zero. So what is the 2 evidence-based targets? The NHS has actually broke it down into 2 different elements. So they've got the NHS carbon footprint and they've got the NHS carbon footprint plus. So within the NHS carbon footprint, it is for the emissions that the NHS control directly, and they're going to be net zero by 2040. Then within the carbon footprint plus, that is the emissions that the NHS can influence, and that is to be net zero by 2045. So these targets informed by evidence, because they are evidence-based targets, and that can be whether they're from science or international commitments, which take into consideration the nature of the business and its position in the economy, and are limited to the current capabilities. So what we can see here is it's a very good outline of just the carbon footprint and the carbon footprint plus. So we can clearly see here within our carbon footprint plus, because this is what we're primarily focused on here as a supplier into the NHS, this is the carbon footprint plus. So within that, they have decided all medical devices, all freight transport, all business services, all construction, all manufacturing, whether that be of products, chemicals and gases, staff commuting, ICT, so any IT and infrastructure in behind it, commissioned health services outside of the NHS, so whether that be private health systems that they actually use and provide a service into the NHS. They've also got food and catering and medicines. So they are elements for the NHS, which is in their scope 3, which is their indirect, but obviously as you as suppliers, that's your element, and hence why it is looking at it within the NHS scope 3 as a whole. So why is the NHS doing this? They are in line with the UK Government's procurement policy. So the UK, as everybody will be aware, the UK have set goals to be net zero. They have also set these UK government procurement policies. So there's the PPN 06-20 and then the PPN 06-21. So we'll run through quickly just the PPN 06-20. That takes into account social values in the award of central government contracts. So under the model, a minimum overall weighting of social value of 10% of the overall score is mandated whenever any of the social value policy outcomes are included in the procurement. So for example, the authority may split the weightings for 30% price, 60% quality, and 10% for social value. So it sends a message to the supply market that social value is important to the contracting authority. So then within PPN 06-21, this is taken into account the carbon reduction plans in the procurement of major government contracts. So the UK government amended the Climate Change Act 2008 in 2019 by introducing a target of at least 100% reduction in the UK carbon account. So that is a reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions compared to the 1990 levels by 2050. This is otherwise known as the net zero target. So this procurement policy note, that's what the PPN stands for, sets out how to take account of suppliers' net zero carbon reduction plans in their procurement of major government contracts. So further within the PPN 06, so the policy and guidance applies to all central government departments, their executive agencies and non-departmental public bodies in conducting procurement procedures, and that's regulated by the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. So the PPN 06-21 was published in the 5th of June 2021 and came into effect for new procurements from the 30th of September 2021. PPN 06-21 applies to the procurement of framework agreements and dynamic purchasing systems, also known as DPS for short, only where it is related to the subject matter of the contract and proportionate, and the anticipated that the individual value of any contract to be awarded under the framework or DPS is £5 million per annum and above. Okay, so the NHS commitment. The NHS made a commitment to reduce emissions through the goods and services it buys from partners and suppliers. The NHS has committed to reaching net zero by 2040 for the emissions they control directly and by 2045 for the emissions they influence. This is through the goods and services they buy from their partners and suppliers. To achieve this goal, they will require the support of their suppliers. And this is why it is vitally important in order for the NHS to achieve these goals that we as suppliers into the NHS must also contribute and help towards that. Not only is this to the NHS, but it's also to the UK government as well, because overarching is the UK government and the NHS is falling in line with the UK government's roadmap journey. So in 2021, the NHS published a roadmap to help suppliers align with the net zero ambition. So what is the roadmap? So from April 2022, all NHS procurements include a minimum 10% net zero and social value rating. So the net zero and social value guidance for the NHS procurement teams helps to unlock health specific outcomes building on the PPN 06-21 or 20, sorry. And then the net zero and social value applied is via the Evergreen Assessment, and that's for the NHS's England medicines tenders. So from April 23, for all new contracts above 5 million per annum, the NHS requires suppliers to publish a carbon reduction plan for their UK Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and also subset of Scope 3 emissions as a minimum, and that's aligning with PPN 06-21. Now, anybody who is aware, within Scope 3, there's 15 categories. So within those categories, there's 5 subsets that is required. The 5 subsets is business travel, employee commuting, there's waste generated as well within your operations, there's upstream transportation and distribution, and downstream transportation and distribution. So that is the 5 detailed within the subset of Scope 3 emissions that must be calculated as a minimum. So the carbon reduction plan and net zero commitment requires for the procurement of NHS goods, services and works. Guidance outlines what is required from the suppliers and how it should be implemented. So from April 2024, this year, the NHS will proportionally extend the carbon reduction plan requirements to cover all new procurements. Then from April 2027, all suppliers will be required to publicly report targets, emissions, and publish a carbon reduction plan for global emissions aligned to the NHS net zero target for all their Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And then from April 2028, the new requirements will be introduced overseeing the provision of carbon footprinting for individual products supplied to the NHS. So the NHS will work with suppliers and regulators to determine the scope and methodology that will be used. So as we can see, just a little bit clearer maybe of an outline. We can see from January 22, the launch of the Sustainable Supplier Framework. Then in April 22, the NHS adopted PPN 06-20 so that all NHS tenders include a minimum 10% net zero and social value rating. From April 23, we can see then it adopted PPN 06-21 so that all contracts above 5 million is now required from suppliers to publish a carbon reduction plan for their direct emissions. Then from April 24, all suppliers will be required to publicly report emissions and publish a carbon reduction plan aligned to the NHS net zero target for their direct emissions, irrespective of contract value. So from April 2027, all suppliers will be required to publicly report emissions and publish a carbon reduction plan aligned to the NHS net zero target for both their direct and indirect emissions. So that's Scope 1, 2 and 3. From April 28, again, new requirements introduced to the overseeing of the provision of carbon footprints for individual products supplied to the NHS. And then from April 2030, all suppliers will be required to demonstrate progress in line with the NHS's net zero targets through published progress reports and continued emissions reporting. And then the NHS will be by 2045 a net zero supply chain and a net zero NHS. So what needs to be done? So from April 23, the NHS will require suppliers bidding for contracts above 5 million per year to produce and publish a carbon reduction plan for Scope 1 and 2 emissions and a subset of the Scope 3 emissions aligned with PPN 06-21. So I'm going to re-emphasize the minimum that has to be done for the Scope 3 emissions. So the subset is the minimum, and that is business travel, employee commuting, that's waste generated, it's upstream transportation and distribution, and downstream transportation and distribution as well. So from this year, from April 2024, the NHS will widen the requirements of PPN 06-21 to cover all procurement regardless of the value. Then from April 27, they will require all suppliers to release a carbon reduction plan, and that must be publicly released as well for all Scope 1, 2 and 3 emission sources. From April 2028, they will determine new requirements to oversee the provision of carbon footprinting for specified supplied products to the NHS. And then from 2030, they will only qualify suppliers to bid for NHS contracts if they can demonstrate their progress through published progress and carbon emissions reporting through the supplier framework. So from 2030, suppliers will only be able to qualify for NHS contracts if they can demonstrate their progress through published progress reports and continued carbon emissions reporting. So the NHS England medicines tender, all suppliers intending to tender for contracts or frameworks administered by the NHS England medicines value and assess will require at the point of submission a valid evergreen supplier, sustainable supplier assessment, as well as a compliant carbon reduction plan. And these requirements are from January 2024. So the evergreen sustainable supplier assessment, this is a tool for suppliers to engage with the NHS on their sustainability journey and understand how to align with the NHS net zero ambition. So it serves as a pathway for communications and data gathering between the suppliers and the NHS decision makers across the NHS organisations, and will provide a mechanism for suppliers to showcase their net zero progress and wider sustainability efforts. So the Evergreen Sustainability Supplier Assessment, it's a self-assessment and reporting tool for suppliers to share sustainability information with the NHS, and it provides a single route for information and data sharing between the suppliers and the NHS. So the assessment can be completed by any supplier who provides or plans to provide goods or services to the NHS England, integrated care boards, or an NHS trust. The Department of Health and Social Care and the NHS systems in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales can also access the information and data. It is hosted within their procurement system, and all suppliers can access the assessment once they've registered. It is recommended that suppliers complete the assessment annually, and the maturity score will be valid for 12 months. However, suppliers will be able to update their annual assessment with significant updates at any time throughout the year where appropriate. So if there has been big changes, or if you have maybe decided to get verification, that will obviously impact your score, and then you can go in and add in information as well, so it will look at your scoring mechanism. So what is the scoring for it? This is what's known as the maturity criteria. So level 1, that is for any supplier publicly committed to net zero carbon and engaged with sustainability. If you want to increase your score, level 2 then is a comprehensive net zero targets and reporting for carbon emissions, with a structured approach to addressing modern slavery and driving social value. Within then level 3, it is 2045 net zero targets that are independently validated and completion of the modern slavery assessment tool. And then within level 4, it is that 2045 net zero targets independently validated across a global organisation, whilst actively taking steps to map supply chain or investigate and mitigate supplier risks of modern slavery. And this was released in June just this year. So it's a summary of the assessments and the level for any supplier. So what can we do? We, as a supplier, if we are sitting on a maturity level of 1, how do we increase? How do we get to a level 2? How do we get to a level 3, etc.? One way we need to do is we need to measure. So we need to measure and we need to calculate what our actual carbon footprint is. There's recommended methodologies. So there is the ISO 14064-1. There is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There's the National Government Environmental Reporting Protocols. And then there is Products and Services, which is PAS 2050. And that's the specification for the assessment of the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of goods and services. So just to take it slightly back a step, because there is a lot of different definitions and terms that is. So I'm just going to clarify some of the terms. So carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality is a state of balance between the CO2 emitted into the atmosphere and the CO2 removed from the atmosphere. Zero carbon is no carbon emissions are being produced. Carbon negative is a reduction of the carbon footprint to less than neutral. So there is a net effect of removing CO2 from the atmosphere rather than adding it. So the carbon trust definition. Carbon neutrality has a minimum requirement of covering scope 1 and 2 emissions, with scope 3 encouraged. Net zero must cover scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So for net zero, there is science-based targets initiatives, which a lot of organisations, you may have heard the terminology used. It is quite commonly used, and it is defined net zero targets for corporate as follows. So to reach a state of net zero emissions for companies implies 2 conditions. First one is to achieve a scale of value chain emission reductions consistent with the depth of abatement achieved in pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot, and to neutralise the impact of any source of residual emissions that remains unfeasible to be eliminated by permanently removing an equivalent amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So that's the terms that you would see, and you may have actually seen them as well within, or you may have heard them as well. So what is carbon neutrality? So to solve the problem of man-made emissions and their effects on climate change, we need to take into account our carbon emissions and make continued efforts to reduce them. But it is impossible to reduce our carbon emissions to zero, no matter how hard we can actually try. So carbon neutrality allows the closing of this gap by purchasing carbon offsets. So for going forward, we are at an important reflection point. So the government, industry and civil society are coming together to take climate action. There is a growing global consensus around zero carbon future. I am sure everybody has heard it, no matter whatever industry you particularly work in, or if you are having any meetings, whether that be with clients or suppliers. Everybody is talking about sustainability and what their carbon footprint is and what their carbon reduction plans are as well. I was having a very in-depth meeting for the last couple of days, and it was evident. It wasn't a greenhouse gas verification I was actually performing. It was a different standard, and it was evident because they were showing me exactly what they were looking to do. And it is in every type of industry we're actually going to see now. So it is on the words, it is on everybody's on their mind as well, of how we can reduce our carbon footprint. And that is to achieve the Paris goals, we must halve global emissions over the next decade and rapidly adapt to our warming climate. To do this, we must all move faster. Now, I don't know where everybody is living in different parts of the country, but I know we were -7 last night here. We have got quite a bit of snow. We do get quite a bit of rain in Northern Ireland, but it is getting much different in our weather patterns. We can see it. We're getting now the extremes of it. So within here, we must take immediate and decisive action is needed to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change and create opportunities in low carbon technologies as well. So engineering is advancing in relation to their carbon technologies. One of the last courses I did, you may have quickly seen, I completed postgraduates, and one was on zero carbon engineering, and the second one, probably more prominently and more controversial, was hydrogen technologies as well, and the emphasis that is on hydrogen and the hope there is on hydrogen as well. So there's a lot of engineering, a lot of work done with universities as well, in order, one, to see if the technology is all working, and two is to train and educate people as well. So for greenwashing, greenwashing is an attempt to capitalise on the growing demand for environmentally sound products. Greenwashing can convey a false impression that a company or its products are environmentally sound, and genuinely green products back up their claims with facts and details. So how do we do this? PAS 2060, it is a specification for the demonstration of carbon neutrality. It specifies the requirements to be met by any entity. An entity is a company. I think in my next couple of slides, hopefully, we'll be able to show exactly what our entity is, seeking to demonstrate carbon neutrality, and that's through quantification, reduction, and offsetting. And that's all the greenhouse gas emissions from a uniquely identified subject. This came into effect in April 2010 and was reissued in April 2014. The ISO 14068-1 release will supersede PAS 2060. So in the background, they are developing an international standard, and that will supersede, obviously, the PAS 2060 standard. So business benefits, it can demonstrate environmental integrity. It provides a clear and credible message to instill in our customers' trust in their environmental messages. It meets increasing customer demand for environmentally friendly products and services. It engage and motivate their staff and stakeholders to reduce costs through operational and behavioural changes, and differentiates their business from their competition to increase their revenue and market share. Probably some of the biggest business benefits we are seeing as an independent verifier is from a tender perspective. A lot of tenders are now asking, what is your carbon footprint? Has it been evaluated? And also from a monetary perspective, it is very much surprising how much is actually looking, one, on cost, and also from upstream, downstream transportation. So just to give a little bit of an example of that, I had a client and we were doing his greenhouse gas inventory. We were in to verify it, and he was looking at his transportation. So he made a product and was transporting it throughout all of England. And he found another manufacturing company. It was literally 15 miles from where he had his site, and this other manufacturing site was delivering their product all throughout England as well. So the two of them actually came together and purchased it was one fleet of vehicles, so it was a van, and was started delivering their own goods and services. Well, it was goods that both of them were producing, and they were delivering them throughout all of England. So rather than one van going, which was only half full, they were sharing it, so it was a full van at all times through two different manufacturing companies. And that purely came down from the fact they were looking at their transportation from a carbon footprint perspective, and they knew they had to reduce it. So in order to reduce it, they were starting to think of different ways that they could actually reduce it. And one of them was to work with other companies that was actually quite close to them. That's only one example, but a lot of it actually will come down to monetary as well. We look at lighting. I think the big thing was to change lighting from normal bulbs into LED lighting. Again, it reduced costs, but it also reduced the amount from your cost from your electricity, but also your usage as well. And it's whenever they start to look at elements like that to implement within an organization, it one reduces costs for a lot of organizations, but also it is reducing your carbon footprint. And it is thinking slightly outside of your box in order to help with your carbon footprint. One thing I would always say is you can only ever know once you start to measure what your carbon footprint is. So the principles around PAS 2060. So PAS 2060 is a standard which sets your measurement. So first off is you measure, then you reduce, then you offset, and the fourth element is you document and you validate that. So within there's examination of documents and plans, and it allows for a specific carbon neutrality statement to be fully verified as well. So what can be certified? So an entity shall, in its determination of the subject, be uniquely identified itself, uniquely identified the subject of the declaration of carbon neutrality, establish all the characteristics, purposes, objectives, or functionality inherent to that subject, establish and take into consideration all activities material to the fulfillment, achievement, or delivery of the subject. So within here, entities include public sector, communities, organisations, Companies are parts of companies. It can also include social groups and clubs, families, or whether it wants to be an individual as well. We do have organisations that are past 2060 verified, and they are, so say they may have 9 different branches, they may have verified 5 of them because maybe those 5 do the same type of work. So that's why we do say it's a company or part of a company, just depends on the organisation. That is very clearly defined within their scope and their boundary as well. So their scope then is any activities, the products, their services, it can be buildings, it can be for projects as well and major developments, it can be for an event or a development as well. So a carbon footprint measurements must include a minimum of 95% of the total calculated emissions. So within PAS 2060, it is very specific that a minimum of 95% of your total emissions have been accounted for. You can exclude emissions that constitute to less than 1% of the total. However, all of those less than 1% cannot add up to any more than 5%. Within its scope 1 is your direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating or cooling. Primarily within the UK, that's primarily electricity. We do have some organisations that do produce steam, and then within different countries there will be heating and cooling systems as well. Within scope 3 then is all other indirect emissions that occur within your company's value chain. So they can be waste treatment, they can be business travel, they can be purchasing of goods, purchasing of services, they can be employee commuting. As I've said, there's 15 categories within that scope 3 that can be accounted for. So to reduce, so we must have a plan to reduce these identified emissions, and this is known as our carbon management plan. Carbon reduction plan, carbon management plan, it is the exact same thing. So it's a public commitment to carbon neutrality. There's a time scale for achieving the carbon neutrality of the defined entity, i.e. your company. There's specific targets for greenhouse gas reductions that are appropriate to the timescale. So the planned means of achieving and maintaining the greenhouse gas reductions is justification of the techniques and measures to be used, the time period, and that any historic reductions are calculated over, and that a constant methodology has been used. So the offsetting strategy to be used, including estimates of quantity required. So the reduction, the declared reduction, can be absolute or intensity based. So the plan must be updated annually and continual improvement. Within PAS 2060, on your first year, that's only your very first year, you are allowed to offset 100% of your carbon footprint. Any year thereafter, there must be reductions. So we, as a verifier, we go in on, say, your second year, we look to see, has there been reductions? Have they been in line with your carbon reduction plan? If they haven't been met, why have they not been met? But also we still need to see reductions. And any residual amount then within PAS 2060 can be offset again. But it's only, we need to see reductions within it. So the offsets. So PAS 2060 requires the total amount of carbon emissions at the end of a reduction period to be offset by high quality, certified carbon credits, which meets the following criteria. So from the PAS 2060 approved schemes, there's the Clean Development Mechanism scheme, There's the joint implementation, there's the gold standard, or the voluntary verified carbon standard. There's genuinely additional reductions that would not have been happened anyway. They are verified by an independent third party to ensure the emission reductions are permanent, avoid leakage. So leakage is emissions that are not increased in another area as a result of project reductions and are not double counted as well. Retired after a maximum of 12 months to a credible registry as well. So there is recognised schemes, offset schemes within PAS 2060, and they have had all of these independent verification done on them as well. So again, what we have looked at is the offset approved schemes. So like I've said, we have the Clean Development Mechanism scheme, we have the joint implementation, and we have EU alliances. We've also got the gold standard or the voluntary carbon standard. Anybody who does know the PAS 2060, it does state the voluntary carbon standard. It is now known as the verified carbon standard. And we've also got the climate, community and biodiversity standard. And then locally within the UK, we've got the woodland carbon code. We've got also the gold standard and the verified carbon standard as well within local domestic schemes. So typical quantities needed. These do very much range in differences of different types of organisations. So for one person in the UK, it equals to 6.5 tonnes of CO2. So one person in the USA equals 16.5 tonnes. And one person in the EU is 6.4 tonnes. So a return flight from the New York to London in economy equates to 1.7 tonnes. In the same business flight, in the same flight in business class is 5 tonnes. I do get asked this quite a bit. Why? It's a flight. It's still going in the same direction. It's a one airplane. Why is there a difference in the tonnage of your CO2 equivalent for your different classes? Very simple. Anybody who sits in economy, you know the amount of seats and the amount of space you have. Anybody who's privileged and goes into even premium economy, slightly bigger seats, less people. Anybody who is in business class, there's a lot larger seats and a lot less people within the same footprint compared to economy. Hence the difference in the actual emissions conversion factors for the different classes within planes. So construction of a building, that's the embedded carbon. So it's per square metre, so it's the gross internal area. So a construction of a 1,000 metre squared building is between 500 to 1,000 tonnes. Again, construction of 100 or 10,000 square metre building is between 5,000 to 10,000 tonnes. And then an office space energy for 100 employees equates to 50 to 100 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So to document it, to verify, so the final stage of the process is the documentation, the verification and declaration of carbon neutrality. So within PAS 2060, it requires a statement that requires standards have been met and they're supported by a QES. You may hear people on about QESs. It's a qualifying explanatory statement. That's all it stands for. So the standard requires public disclosure of all documentation supporting the carbon neutrality statement. This in practice includes proof of your emission reductions, withdrawal of your offsets credits, your carbon footprint report, your carbon management plan, or basically your carbon reduction plan, and your QES, which is your qualifying explanatory statement. So the requirement to provide all this information is fundamental to the final validation of carbon neutrality status. So the verification process, it permits 3 separate types of conformity: self-validation, validation by a non-accredited organisation, or independent third-party validation. So NQA is a UKAS accredited energy and environmental management system certification body and is able to provide this fully independent validation of carbon neutrality. So anybody looking to go for the PAS 2060 or indeed a greenhouse gas inventory, we do verify a greenhouse gas inventory as well. As independent verifiers, we go in and we go through, we take a sample of the data. And I have been doing this now nearly on 2.5 years as an independent verifier. I'm a mathematician, and that was my primary degree was in mathematics, so I'm very maths orientated. So absolutely relish going in doing the verification. I'm a sad person whenever I like figures, but I do. I would say, and I can hand on heart say this, 99% of the companies we go in to verify, there is changes required throughout the verification process. And that's why I would always recommend an independent third party verification, purely because we do go around different organisations. We are working at this, this is our job, this is what we do. And we also are able to basically give the verification and the rubber stamp to make sure any organisation's greenhouse gas inventory and their carbon footprint is correct at that time. So tips for achieving carbon neutrality: to seek accreditation, make the most of technology. There is dashboards and there is solutions out there in order to calculate your carbon footprint. There is a number of organisations that do this. There's a number of consultants out there that is there to help as well. And a number of our consultants have been on our courses and have went through the ISO 14064 lead verifier courses, as well as PAS 2060, as well as greenhouse gas inventory courses. So there's a massive amount of knowledge and help for any supplier that needs to calculate their carbon footprint. So leadership must come from the top. So it's embedding the large scale change is only successful if there is buy-ins and visible support from the senior leaders within the organisation. I think we are at a time where there is such a growing emphasis on looking at our carbon footprint. It is very much top of the agenda for a lot of leaders, hopefully in a lot of organisations as well. Share your responsibility across the company. It is not one employee we ever deal with. We look at a different and a large amount of employees that we look at, and you must get help from different departments as well within your organisation. Work with other organisations and set science-based targets. Make sure they're fair in cutting your carbon footprint in order to reduce or to reach your global goal of attaining net zero emissions as well. So what is the next steps? As I've said, we have got courses, a 2-day course looking at understanding and achieving carbon neutrality. We also do a 1-day course on your greenhouse gas inventory, and within that there is examples and live working that all participants both calculate a carbon footprint, and that is the goal from both of those courses, that you're able to calculate a carbon footprint. We do it on a mock manufacturing company, but this can be applied to all different organisations. So we have very little time, unfortunately, for any questions. If there is any questions, if you just want to pop them in. However, I am very much aware we literally have about 3 minutes left. I did say I do like to talk, so hopefully I didn't speak too quickly for anybody. So if there is any questions, if there is anything that I'm not able to get to, please, we will be able to get back to people thereafter. So one of the questions is, so is net zero actually specifically incorporated into PAS 2060, or just that reductions must be made? Within net zero, you're looking obviously at how your carbon reduction plan within PAS 2060, a carbon reduction plan is a massive element of it. Within PAS 2060, you must look to see what your carbon footprint is and also what your carbon reduction plan is. However, carbon to be net zero, we're looking at how everything can actually be engineered out within the element that we're actually providing as well. So it is very much working hand in hand in order to be net zero. It is a stepping stone for any organisation to be able to work to in order to become net zero. So yes, it very much works hand in hand with it. Yes, so one of the questions here is, how quickly will the NHS enforce this? I realise that they've target dates, but they're already falling behind on those. The NHS has got target dates in place. Primarily, the supplier assessment is one of them. However, the overall arching goal of 2045 is not from the NHS, unfortunately, itself. It's from the UK government. So there is going to be a lot more emphasis and a lot more emphasis on working towards the goals, especially for 2030 for a lot of organisations. We're already in 2024. So we have only 6 years in order to start looking at massive reductions in our carbon footprint as well. So they will start to look at a lot more emphasis and enforcing it as well, unfortunately. Okay. Any other questions that I haven't been, I haven't actually got back to? This will be circulated and we'll be able to see any questions come the end of this, and we will be able to get back to any specific. Apologies that I have run over slightly on time. I'm very much aware it's just down to the hour, and if there is anything specific, if you would like to go on to the NQA website, and there will be there's a chat box within there, and any information can also, and any questions can be answered as well. We've also got Amber Dixon. Amber, I think, maybe on the call here as well. So Amber is our sustainability manager within NQA and does organise me quite a bit as well in my time and for different people. So as well, any questions can be directed to Amber and she can then obviously feed them back as well to myself. So I'd like to thank everybody for your time and to listening to a Northern Ireland accent for today. And hopefully everybody will enjoy and have a lovely weekend. So thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you.